Imagine a world shrouded in darkness. War and famine ravage the land, knowledge is hoarded in monasteries, and plague stalks the populace. Europe, after the fall of Rome, was often called the Dark Ages, a time of turmoil, ignorance, and pandemics like the Black Death. For centuries, progress slowed to a crawl as people struggled simply to survive. But just when it seemed the light of learning might flicker out completely, a spark was struck in Italy. A cultural rebirth, a renaissance, began to dawn, bringing light to the darkness. Over the next few minutes, we'll travel from the medieval shadows into the brilliance of the Renaissance, discovering how this extraordinary era changed art, science, religion, and society forever. By the end, you'll see why the Renaissance is credited with bridging the gap between the Middle Ages and modern civilization, and how its legacy still shapes our world today. So settle in for an epic journey through history. We'll meet the fearless artists, thinkers, and explorers who dared to challenge old ideas and ignite a revolution of the mind. We'll witness the tension between tradition and innovation, faith and reason, darkness and light. And we'll find inspiration in how human creativity and curiosity triumphed against the odds. Welcome to the story of the Renaissance, a story of transformation that will leave you motivated to seek your own light in even the darkest times. Let's begin our journey from darkness to light. To appreciate the revolution of the Renaissance, we first must understand the depth of the darkness that came before. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, Europe entered a long period of relative isolation and stagnation. Much of the advanced knowledge of the classical world, the philosophy of Greece, the engineering of Rome, was neglected or forgotten in Western Europe. Education was largely confined to monasteries. Art and literature often served only religious purposes, bound by strict church teachings. Few advances in science or art took place during these centuries. It's no wonder later scholars branded this era the Dark Ages, picturing medieval Europe as a place of backwardness and ignorance. Life in medieval times could indeed be harsh. Widespread warfare and violence were common, as kingdoms and lords battled for power. Famine periodically swept through villages when crops failed. Perhaps most devastating of all, the Black Death plague erupted in the mid-14th century, killing tens of millions, up to half the population in some regions. Fear and superstition often filled the void left by understanding. Many people saw such calamities as divine punishment or signs of the apocalypse. In this atmosphere, questioning the established order was dangerous. The Catholic Church was the dominant authority on knowledge and morality, and deviating from its doctrine could be deemed heresy. Yet, it's important to note that the Dark Ages label can be misleading. Medieval Europe was not uniformly bleak. There were flickers of learning and preservation of knowledge. Monasteries kept Latin and some classical texts alive by copying manuscripts. Gothic cathedrals soared toward the heavens, feats of engineering and art in their own right. Still, compared to what was to come, the medieval mindset was largely inward-looking and static. For centuries, Europeans looked back to the glory of Rome as a lost golden age. Little did they know, a new dawn was on the horizon. By the 1300s, conditions were ripe for change. The stage was set for an awakening, a rebirth of learning, culture, and optimism, unlike anything Europe had seen in a millennium. The first sparks of the Renaissance kindled in 14th century Italy, particularly in the prosperous city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan. These were bustling centers of trade and finance, where new ideas could take root. Here, a revolutionary way of thinking emerged: humanism. Rather than focusing only on divine matters and the afterlife, humanists turned their attention to human beings and the world around them. They believed man was the measure of all things, that humans have beauty, worth, and unlimited potential to achieve great things in this life. This was a radical shift from the medieval view that emphasized humanity's sinfulness and the need to focus solely on God. Humanist writers and scholars in Italy broke from tradition by embracing secular subjects, worldly topics like history, literature, ethics, and politics, alongside, or even instead of purely religious themes. They looked back to the classical civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration, seeing those eras as pinnacles of human achievement. In their eyes, the centuries after Rome's fall were a dark age, but now it was time for a rinascita, a rebirth of classical learning and values. The very word Renaissance, from the French for rebirth, later came to define this age of renewal. One early pioneer was the poet and scholar Francesco Petrarch, 1304–1374, often called the father of humanism. Petrarch scoured monastery libraries for lost Latin manuscripts and even climbed mountaintops just for the personal insight of the experience, an almost unheard-of attitude in the Middle Ages. He collected the works of Cicero and other ancient writers, sharing them with fellow scholars. Petrarch also wrote passionate sonnets in Italian about his love for a woman named Laura, celebrating human emotion and individual experience in a way that felt fresh and liberating. His friend Giovanni Boccaccio, 1313–1375, likewise embraced humanist ideals. In the aftermath of the Black Death, Boccaccio wrote The Decameron, a collection of 100 witty, earthy tales told by young people seeking refuge from the plague. Through these stories, he painted a vivid picture of human folly, love, and desire, subjects that were decidedly worldly. Boccaccio's work is considered some of the best prose of the early Renaissance, and it showed that literature could entertain and enlighten rather than solely preach moral lessons. These early humanists placed humanity at the center of the universe in their philosophy. They argued that it was not sinful to admire the beauty of the human body, the brilliance of the human mind, or the accomplishments of human societies. On the contrary, celebrating such things honored the Creator's work. Education, they believed, should nurture well-rounded individuals. The humanists revived the ancient idea of a liberal arts education, studying grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, philosophy, as well as mathematics, astronomy, music. The goal was to develop one's talents fully in multiple fields, creating a Renaissance man, someone like the multi-talented genius Leon Battista Alberti, who declared, "A man can do all things if he will." This broad educational vision was a stark contrast to the narrow scholastic curriculum of medieval universities, which had focused mainly on theology. As humanist ideas spread, they began to subtly undermine the old medieval order. People started to think for themselves more freely, and to question long-held assumptions. Writers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola boldly asserted that there are no limits to what man can accomplish. In 1486, Pico wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man, proclaiming that humans, uniquely, had the freedom to shape their own destiny, to be as lowly as beasts or as divine as angels. Such optimism about human nature was intoxicating. It lit a fire of inspiration across Italy. The spark of humanism was turning into a flame, preparing the way for even greater changes in art, science, and every sphere of life. In the 1400s, one city in particular became the beating heart of the Renaissance, Florence. This Italian city-state nestled in Tuscany was wealthy, independent, and proud of its cultural heritage. Florence had been a center of medieval European banking and trade, which meant it had both the money and the cosmopolitan atmosphere to foster new ideas. It's often said the Renaissance was born in Florence, and for good reason. Many of the era's greatest artists and thinkers either came from Florence or did their most important work there. A huge factor in Florence's rise was the Medici family, a dynasty of bankers who became de facto rulers of the city. For much of the 15th century, the Medici, especially Cosimo de' Medici, and later his grandson Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, used their vast fortune to patronize budding artists, architects, and scholars. The Medici essentially invested in culture the way others invest in stocks. They funded the creation of magnificent works of art and architecture, and they gathered around them a circle of humanist thinkers. Under their leadership, Florence buzzed with creative energy. Great Italian writers, philosophers, and artists knew they were part of something new and profound. They even declared openly that they were in the midst of an intellectual and artistic revolution, one that was a clear break from the gloom of the Dark Ages. The skyline of Florence itself tells the story of this Renaissance spirit. In 1436, the city witnessed an engineering marvel, the completion of Brunelleschi's dome atop the Florence Cathedral. For decades, the enormous cathedral had stood without a dome because no one could figure out how to span such a wide space. Then Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith turned architect with a genius for mathematics, devised a daring solution. He studied the dome of the ancient Roman Pantheon and then engineered a double-shell dome, building one dome inside another, with innovative support ribs and without needing any scaffolding to hold it up during construction. Many thought it impossible, but Brunelleschi succeeded. His dome, soaring high above Florence, became a symbol of the new age. It married classical inspiration, the Pantheon, with cutting-edge engineering and artistic vision. Architects across Europe came to marvel at it. This success wasn't just about a building, it announced that the impossible was now possible. Human ingenuity had triumphed, echoing the humanist belief in unlimited potential. Wandering the streets of Florence in the 1480s, you might have bumped into Leonardo da Vinci with his sketchbook, or seen Michelangelo as a teenage apprentice under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici. Art and learning were everywhere. The city's economy thrived not only on banking, but on the production of fine luxury goods. Textiles, goldwork, and art became perhaps the most prized product of all. Wealthy merchants and churchmen competed to commission the best artists to decorate their chapels and palaces. This patronage system meant that if you had talent, Florence was the place to be. The Medici alone supported dozens of artists and projects, including sponsoring the Platonic Academy, where scholars like Marsilio Ficino translated the works of Plato into Latin for the first time in Western Europe. Knowledge that had been lost for centuries flowed into Florence. Precious, ancient Greek manuscripts, obtained from Byzantine scholars and other sources, were studied and revered. In fact, a major influx of knowledge came around 1453, when the city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Ottoman Turks. In the wake of that event, many Greek scholars fled to Italy, carrying with them bundles of ancient manuscripts and their deep understanding of Greek language and culture. Works by Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and other classical thinkers, some of which had been virtually unknown in the Latin West, suddenly became accessible to Italian intellectuals. The impact was electric. Lost texts that had been preserved in the East for centuries now fueled Western scholarship. Scholars like Ficino and Leonardo Bruni eagerly translated these works and incorporated their ideas into the growing humanist framework. It's no coincidence that the Renaissance fire burned hottest in Italy at this very moment. The library of classical knowledge was being refilled, and with it came illumination. As one historian put it, the fall of Constantinople helped spark the Renaissance by showering Italy with the riches of Greek antiquity. By the late 15th century, Florence had earned its title as the cradle of the Renaissance. Under Lorenzo de' Medici's rule, 1469 to 1492, the city enjoyed a period of relative peace and became a showcase of art, learning, and political innovation. It wasn't a democracy in the modern sense. Power often stayed in elite hands, but there was a degree of civic pride and participation that harkened back to ancient Roman ideals. Florentines prided themselves on their city's republican traditions. Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and writer, would later reflect on these political realities. In 1513, after observing the intrigues of Italian politics, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, a frank handbook for rulers on how to maintain power. Dispensing with moral idealism, he advised that a wise ruler might have to behave less than virtuously for the good of the state. His name would become synonymous with political ruthlessness, but Machiavelli's work was also a product of Renaissance humanist inquiry. He studied history, like the lives of Roman leaders, to draw practical lessons, and he dared to describe politics as it really was, not as the church or traditional morality said it ought to be. Florence, with its mix of classical heritage and contemporary innovation, produced not just great art, but new ideas about how society and government could function in a changing world. However, the Renaissance in Florence was not without conflict. In the 1490s, after Lorenzo's death, the city went through a crisis that showed the tension between old beliefs and new ways. A fiery Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola gained influence, decrying what he saw as the excesses and vanities of Renaissance culture. To him, Florence's flourishing art, secular learning, and even fashionable clothing were temptations leading people away from God. Under Savonarola's sway, many Florentines became convinced that the apocalypse was near and that the city must purify itself. In 1497, Savonarola organized the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities, an enormous bonfire in Florence's main square where sinful objects were burned: books, paintings, fine dresses, mirrors, musical instruments, even cosmetics. It's said that even Botticelli, one of Florence's greatest painters, threw some of his own paintings into the flames out of religious fervor, though thankfully his masterpiece, The Birth of Venus, was spared. The sky filled with the smoke of art and culture being literally incinerated. This dramatic episode was a backlash against the very movement that had made Florence shine. Ultimately, Florentines tired of Savonarola's harsh rule. He was excommunicated and executed for his extreme ideas in 1498. The city resumed its path of artistic and intellectual pursuits, but the Bonfire of the Vanities remains a symbol of the clash between medieval religious fanaticism and the Renaissance spirit of free expression. The flame of the Renaissance, however, was not so easily extinguished. Florence's example had already spread far beyond its walls, lighting up all of Europe. When we think of the Renaissance, the first names that often come to mind are its incomparable artists, the masters who revolutionized painting, sculpture, and architecture. In medieval art, the human figure was usually flat, stylized, and purely symbolic. But Renaissance artists rediscovered realism and naturalism, striving to depict people and objects as they truly appeared in the world. They developed new techniques to do it: perspective to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface, chiaroscuro, light and shadow, to give figures volume, and careful observation of anatomy and nature to capture details. Art became a fusion of science and creativity. Emotions and human experiences, joy, grief, awe, began to shine through the paint and marble, making art more relatable and powerful than ever before. It started with early pioneers like Giotto di Bondone, 1266 to 1337, an Italian painter who is often considered the first artist to break from the medieval style. Giotto had an uncanny ability to portray human emotion. In his frescoes, figures aren't stiff. They gesture and weep with convincing feeling. His paintings in the Scrovegni Chapel, Padua, show lifelike expressions of grief and love, bringing biblical scenes into human focus. Giotto's work influenced generations of artists after him. In a time when others were painting symbolic halos and gold backgrounds, Giotto painted blue skies and volumetric bodies. He gave the first hint of the Renaissance emphasis on this world, this life. An observer in 1400 could look at Giotto's work from decades earlier and sense that something new was brewing in art. By the 15th century, techniques had advanced rapidly. Artists in Florence like Masaccio mastered perspective, making viewers feel they could step into a painting. Donatello sculpted figures like his bronze David, 1440s, with a striking individuality and realism. It was the first freestanding nude statue of a male since ancient times. Shocking to some, but a bold statement that classical art was reborn. Each decade brought new innovations and geniuses, and then came the High Renaissance in the late 15th to early 16th century, an almost miraculous explosion of talent centered in Florence, Rome, and other Italian cities. Foremost among the High Renaissance titans was Leonardo da Vinci, 1542 to 1519. Leonardo truly earned the title Renaissance Man. He was a painter, an inventor, an engineer, a scientist, a musician, and more. His curiosity knew no bounds. In his notebooks, we find sketches of helicopters and tanks centuries ahead of their time, studies of human anatomy based on dissections he conducted in secret, diagrams of plants and water flows, even doodles of faces and inventions born from his restless imagination. And when he picked up a paintbrush, the results were revolutionary. Leonardo's paintings like The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa achieved an unprecedented realism and psychological depth. In The Last Supper, he captures the exact moment Jesus tells his disciples one of them will betray him. The shock and emotion ripple through the group, each apostle reacting in a uniquely human way. And the Mona Lisa's famously enigmatic smile demonstrates Leonardo's mastery of sfumato, delicate gradations of tone, to create lifelike subtlety. It's no wonder that Leonardo's contemporaries were in awe of him. He exemplified the Renaissance ideal that art and science could enrich each other. For instance, Leonardo's anatomical drawings of muscles and bones directly informed how he painted human figures with such convincing realism. As one modern analysis notes, his Vitruvian Man drawing, depicting a man fitting perfectly into a circle and a square, exemplifies the blend of art and science during the Renaissance, reflecting Leonardo's deep understanding of proportion and his effort to relate man to nature. Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man, circa 1490, a study of ideal human proportions, illustrates the Renaissance fusion of art, science, and the classical obsession with harmony. Leonardo believed the human body's workings were an analogy for the workings of the universe. If Leonardo represented the harmonious blending of disciplines, Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1545 to 1564, embodied the fiery passion and superhuman effort of Renaissance art. Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor by training. His motto was, "I carve figures free from the stone." And indeed, when the city of Florence had a massive, abandoned block of marble that two other sculptors had given up on, it was the young Michelangelo who, at age 26, took on the challenge. From that ruined block, he carved the towering statue of David, 1501 to 1504, a masterpiece of such beauty and anatomical perfection that it stunned his contemporaries. Michelangelo's David, standing 17 feet tall, depicts the biblical hero in the moment before battling Goliath, every muscle taut with controlled power, his gaze intense. The statue symbolized the defiant spirit of Florence itself, a small republic daring to challenge giant adversaries. Interestingly, this marble had been quarried and roughly shaped decades earlier for a project that was abandoned. Michelangelo not only salvaged it, he transformed it. One witness described the completion of David as the bringing back to life of one who was dead, as if the discarded stone block had been resurrected into living form. The statue was so magnificent that instead of hoisting it onto the cathedral roof as originally intended, Florentine officials placed it in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall, as a proud emblem of the city. To this day, Michelangelo's David stands for the Renaissance genius of seeing possibility and beauty where others saw nothing. Michelangelo's fame in sculpture led Pope Julius II to invite him to Rome with another commission, one that Michelangelo was reluctant to take. In 1508, the Pope asked Michelangelo to paint frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican's private chapel. Michelangelo actually tried to refuse, insisting he was a sculptor, not a painter. Painting an enormous ceiling, 65 feet above the floor, with complex biblical scenes and dozens of figures, was a task he felt unqualified for. But Julius II was not the kind of man to take no for an answer. Michelangelo eventually agreed, and he would spend the next 4 years, 1508 to 1512, on scaffolding, contorting his body to paint the vast ceiling, one section at a time. The physical toll was immense. Imagine craning your neck upward hour after hour, day after day. Michelangelo even wrote a poem to a friend describing the misery of it. "I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat, my stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a bow. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." This almost comical lament shows the very human side of creating a divine masterpiece. The man literally suffered for his art, feeling at times utterly defeated. Yet, he persevered. When the ceiling was finally revealed, its impact was immediate and lasting. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is a tour de force of imagination. Central panels with scenes from Genesis, including the iconic creation of Adam, where God's finger nearly touches Adam's, surrounded by prophets, sibyls, and ignudi, nude youths, in a grand humanist conception of the relationship between God and man. It was as if Michelangelo had opened a window to the heavens and yet filled it with muscular, vividly human figures. The feat might never be duplicated, and it indeed came at the cost of the artist's health and comfort. But it stands 500+ years later as one of the greatest artistic achievements in history. Michelangelo would later paint the Last Judgment on the chapel's altar wall and design the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, further cementing his legacy. But it's that image of him, stubbornly lying on his back, paint dribbling onto his face, refusing to quit, that captures the Renaissance drive for artistic perfection. The Renaissance produced many other artistic giants as well. Raphael, 1483 to 1520, a generation younger, learned from Leonardo and Michelangelo, and then developed his own elegant style. His fresco, The School of Athens in the Vatican, painted 1510 to 1511, is a tribute to classical philosophy, showing Plato and Aristotle surrounded by mathematicians, scientists, and thinkers, with Raphael cleverly painting Leonardo's face onto Plato and even sneaking Michelangelo in as a brooding figure on the steps. It was a perfect Renaissance statement, ancient philosophers depicted with the nobility and realism of contemporary figures, all under a majestic vaulted hall reminiscent of Roman architecture. Raphael's work exudes balance and clarity. He synthesized the advancements of his peers into harmonious compositions. In Venice, Titian, 1488 to 1576, was creating vibrant paintings with groundbreaking use of color and brushwork, and his long career would greatly influence Western art. In the north of Europe, Albrecht Dürer, 1471 to 1528, in Germany, admired the Italian masters and combined their techniques with northern detail, becoming a virtuoso of woodcuts and oil painting, and one of the first to view himself as an artist genius, signing and marketing his work widely. Sandro Botticelli in Florence painted mythological scenes like The Birth of Venus, 1480s, reviving pagan themes with Christian undertones, something unimaginable a century prior, when non-biblical subjects had been rare. Now, even pagan gods and ancient heroes found their way into art, often as allegories or symbols of humanist ideas. The Renaissance artist saw no contradiction in celebrating both the sacred and the secular. All realms of human experience were their canvas. What made Renaissance art so revolutionary was not only its technical brilliance, but its underlying message. human beings and the natural world are worth observing closely and portraying truthfully. In a sense, every portrait by Leonardo or Raphael, every human figure painted with realistic anatomy, was making a statement that the material world had value, that knowledge came not just from scripture but from sight and experience. Art became a form of inquiry, and by spreading ideas visually, art also became a powerful means of communication for Renaissance values. A single painting of a serene Madonna or a noble ancient philosopher could inspire as much thought about beauty, truth, and human potential as a learned essay. The masters of Renaissance art turned their craft into a language that everyone, rich or poor, literate or not, could understand and marvel at. In doing so, they changed how people saw the world and themselves, bringing society from the symbolic darkness of the medieval to the clear light of reality and creativity. For the first few decades, the Renaissance was mostly an Italian phenomenon. But as the 15th century progressed, its light spread across Europe. Improved commerce, the movement of scholars and artists, and critically, a revolutionary new technology helped carry Renaissance ideas far and wide. That technology was the printing press, arguably one of the most important inventions in human history. In the 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg in Germany perfected a method of mass-producing books with movable metal type. Suddenly, information could be copied quickly, cheaply, and in great numbers. It was as disruptive in its day as the internet in ours. By 1500, printing presses had sprung up in dozens of cities, and millions of books and pamphlets circulated around the continent. Ideas that once took months or years to spread by word of mouth now spread in a matter of weeks. The printing press became the accelerator of the Renaissance. In the early days of Humanism, Petrarch and Boccaccio's works had been copied by hand, reaching only a limited elite. But now, little-known texts from early humanist authors, like Petrarch's letters or Boccaccio's tales, could be printed and distributed to the masses. Ancient classics, say a work of Plato or an essay by Cicero, once lost or rare, could be published in quantity for scholars across Europe to study. Knowledge was no longer chained to the monastery desk. It was leaping from city to city. Literacy began to rise as more people had reason to learn to read. A cultural unity started to form. An educated European in England might be reading the same Erasmus treatise or Italian sonnets that a merchant in Antwerp or a student in Krakow was reading. Crucially, printing also allowed new vernacular literature to flourish. During the Middle Ages, Latin was the language of scholarship, but now writers increasingly wrote in their local languages, Italian, French, English, Spanish, German, etc., so that ordinary people could read their works. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, an explosion of Renaissance literature occurs outside Italy. François Rabelais in France wrote satirical humanist tales, Gargantua and Pantagruel. Miguel de Cervantes in Spain, a bit later, would write Don Quixote, often called the first modern novel, and in England, a poet-playwright named William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, emerged, who would be so influential he's often considered the greatest writer in the English language. Shakespeare's work, coming at the tail end of the Renaissance period, was deeply shaped by Renaissance currents. The interest in classical drama and history. Think of plays like Julius Caesar, the rich understanding of human nature and individual character, the exuberance of language newly liberated from medieval constraints. England's Elizabethan era, late 1500s, during which Shakespeare wrote, is considered the English Renaissance, a blossoming of literature and music in a land far from Italy. But how did Renaissance ideas actually make their way north? Partly through travel and trade. Italian artists were invited to foreign courts. Merchants and diplomats from other lands spent time in Italian cities and carried home what they learned. For example, in 1494, the French king invaded Italy, beginning decades of Italian wars. And although war is destructive, French nobles also became exposed to Italian art and luxury. They hauled back paintings, sculptures, and even Italian craftspeople. The marriage between the King of England's sister and a duke from Burgundy, in modern Belgium, led to a cultural exchange that helped ignite the Northern Renaissance. One towering figure of the Northern Renaissance was Desiderius Erasmus of Holland, 1466 to 1536. Erasmus was a brilliant scholar and writer who became the leading humanist of Northern Europe. Fluent in Latin and Greek, he produced a new translation of the New Testament and wrote In Praise of Folly, a witty critique of society's abuses, including some aimed at the Church. Erasmus helped define the humanist movement outside Italy by emphasizing piety combined with learning. He wanted to reform society by educating people, advocating a return to simple Christian ethics, while also poking fun at superstitions. His letters and books were printed and read widely. He is sometimes called the teacher of Europe. Through Erasmus and others, the Renaissance emphasis on critical thinking and classical learning spread into universities from Spain to Poland. Meanwhile, across the continent, local artists absorbed Italian innovations and then added their own twists. In the Netherlands, Flanders, painters like Jan van Eyck, active early 1400s, had already pioneered the use of oil paint to create stunningly detailed, realistic works, arguably a parallel development to Italian art. Later, Peter Bruegel the Elder in the mid-1500s painted vivid scenes of peasant life and landscapes, subjects that Italian art didn't typically cover. In Germany, as mentioned, Albrecht Dürer traveled to Italy, met Leonardo and others, and brought Renaissance techniques back north, merging them with German craft. He also used the printing revolution to his advantage by creating woodcuts and engravings that could be printed in huge numbers, making him one of the first internationally famous artists, and one of the first to have a commercial brand with his initials AD monogram. In England, beyond literature, the Renaissance influenced thought on law, politics, and science as well. Thinkers like Thomas More, an English humanist and contemporary of Erasmus, wrote Utopia, 1516, in Latin, imagining an ideal society and critiquing his own. Even as far as Transylvania or Sweden, one finds kings hiring Renaissance tutors for their children or trying to build Italianate palaces. The spread was not uniform or equal. Some regions embraced the new learning more than others, but by 1600, it's fair to say the Renaissance had touched all of Western and Central Europe in some form. One more interesting aspect of the Renaissance spreading, it wasn't just a one-way influence of Italy to the world. Cross-cultural interactions were growing. For instance, Poland-Lithuania in the 1500s had an influx of Italian artists and architects. King Sigismund's chapel in Krakow was designed by an Italian. And in turn, Polish printing presses and astronomers like Copernicus, we'll get to him soon, influenced broader Europe. In Eastern Europe, some areas like Russia mostly resisted Renaissance influence at first. Russia remained aligned with Byzantine traditions until much later. But eventually, even there, by the 17th century, changes in art and thought occurred under Western influence. The common thread in the spread of Renaissance ideas was the growing connectivity of the world. Trade routes and diplomacy carried more than goods. They carried knowledge. And when knowledge arrived, the printing press amplified it. If one Italian wrote a new theory or painted a new style, within years there could be copies, prints, or descriptions circulating abroad. In short, by the 1500s, the Renaissance was no longer just Italian, it had become a European phenomenon. The lights were coming on all over the map, and a once dark continent was illuminated by a patchwork of Renaissance brilliance adapted to local colors. As the Renaissance encouraged people to look at the world with fresh eyes, it wasn't only the intellectual and artistic world that expanded, the physical world suddenly grew much larger too. The 15th and 16th centuries marked the beginning of the Age of Discovery, when Europeans, driven by curiosity, ambition, and economic motives, set sail across unknown seas. In doing so, they effectively ended the medieval isolation of Europe and connected continents in a way never done before. It all began with the quest for new trade routes. The old Silk Road to Asia had been costly and dangerous, and the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and the Middle East made eastern Mediterranean routes harder. So, explorers and monarchs looked to the sea. Portugal took an early lead. Navigators like Bartolomeo Dias and Vasco da Gama, backed by Prince Henry, the Navigator, pushed down the coast of Africa. In 1488, Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving one could sail around Africa's tip. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, establishing a sea route from Europe to Asia at last. However, the most famous voyage came in 1492. An Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, convinced the world was round, as were most educated people, though the exact circumference was debated, believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Backed by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Columbus set sail and, after a harrowing voyage, landed in the Caribbean, believing at first he had reached islands near India. He was, of course, wrong about the geography, but had in fact discovered a new world from the European perspective. Columbus's voyages, he made 4, opened the floodgates of European exploration of the Americas. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro would reach the Aztec and Inca empires in the early 1500s, toppling them and claiming vast lands for Spain. Meanwhile, Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian sailing for Spain and Portugal, realized these lands were not Asia, but a new continent, and the Americas are named after him. The world map was being redrawn. Soon, voyages grew ever more ambitious. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, sailing for Spain, set off to circumnavigate the globe. Although Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, one of his ships continued west and made it back to Spain in 1522, the first circumnavigation of Earth in history. The Portuguese, not content with just India, reached farther, establishing outposts in the Spice Islands, Indonesia, and even reaching Japan by 1543. The English and French sent explorers to North America, John Cabot, Jacques Cartier, etc., searching for a northwest passage and finding rich fishing grounds and new territories. New shipping routes were thus charted to the Americas, Africa, Asia. The entire globe was slowly being connected. These discoveries utterly changed Europeans' understanding of the world. Imagine reading Ptolemy's ancient geography in 1480, which showed only Europe, Asia, and a bit of Africa. Then by 1550, seeing maps that showed 2 massive continents, North and South America, that were completely absent from classical knowledge. It was humbling and thrilling. Suddenly, the classical authorities didn't have all the answers. New knowledge was out there to be found firsthand. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry dovetailed perfectly with the age of exploration. Both valued observation and experience over blind acceptance of tradition. When explorers brought back strange plants, animals, and tales of new peoples, it was as if the universe had revealed delightful secrets. European diet and culture would soon change. Think tomatoes and potatoes from the Americas changing cuisine, or chocolate and coffee becoming new delicacies. There was also a darker side. Colonization and conquest often wrought devastation on indigenous populations through disease and subjugation. The Renaissance pride in human achievement did not prevent Europeans from treating non-European lives as lesser. Indeed, the same era that saw utopia written and human dignity trumpeted also saw the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and brutal colonial empires. These contradictions would play out over centuries. But within the frame of the Renaissance mindset, exploration was generally seen as a triumph of human will and knowledge. brave sailors expanding the limits of the known, much like scientists expanding the understanding of nature. Speaking of science, as explorers expanded horizons on Earth, scholars were expanding horizons in the sky. The scientific revolution, which overlapped the late Renaissance, began to fundamentally alter how people conceived the cosmos. In 1543, the same year that Michelangelo finished the Last Judgment fresco, and just as the Council of Trent was beginning, more on that later, a quiet Polish church canon and astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus published a book that would upend astronomy. In On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, stating that the Earth and other planets orbit the Sun, rather than the Sun and planets orbiting Earth. This idea was not entirely unprecedented. Ancient Greek astronomer Aristarchus had speculated it. But Ptolemy's geocentric model had been gospel for over 1,400 years. By making the first modern scientific argument for heliocentrism, Copernicus truly changed everything in terms of humanity's place in the universe. At first, his theory was debated in academic circles and didn't attract condemnation. It was very technical, filled with math, and not widely read outside experts. But the gauntlet had been thrown. Observation and mathematics suggested that Earth was not the center of creation, a profound philosophical and religious implication. As the 1600s dawned, scientists fueled by Renaissance curiosity made rapid advances. Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642, an Italian polymath sometimes called the father of modern science, improved the telescope and pointed it at the heavens in 1609. What he saw shocked the world. Mountains and craters on the moon, so not a perfect celestial orb, countless new stars invisible to the naked eye, sunspots on the sun, and moons orbiting Jupiter. Those moons of Jupiter, which Galileo called Medicean stars to honor his Medici patrons, were especially significant. Here was proof of a miniature Copernican system. Not everything in the universe orbited Earth, because clearly these moons orbited Jupiter. Galileo published his findings in 1610, The Starry Messenger, and later observed the phases of Venus which strongly supported the heliocentric model. Galileo's evidence and lively writing made the sky a topic of enormous public interest. He wrote in Italian, not just scholarly Latin, so his ideas reached a wider audience. By championing Copernicus's theory openly, however, he drew the ire of the church authorities. Again, more on that soon. But his contributions were pivotal. Galileo basically gave empirical weight to Copernicus's elegant hypothesis. He also formulated laws of motion and greatly advanced physics. Other scientists across Europe joined the revolution. Johannes Kepler in Germany took Copernicus's model and refined it, showing that planets orbit in ellipses, not perfect circles. This made the heliocentric model even more accurate in predicting planetary motions. By the time we get to 1687 and Isaac Newton's work, which unified physics and astronomy, the scientific revolution had bloomed from the seeds planted in the Renaissance. The key is that the Renaissance made that revolution possible by shifting attitudes. Scholars were no longer content to just read Aristotle and accept old knowledge. They wanted to experiment, observe, discover. As one historian put it, the Renaissance desire to closely observe reality in art and life naturally extended to observing the natural world scientifically. But let's stay in the 1500s for now, where we see that this era, in sum, was expanding both the geographical and intellectual horizons of Europeans. A person born in 1400 might have thought the world was basically one hemisphere with some distant edges, and that the sky was fixed and unchanging. That same person's great-grandchild in 1600 knew that Earth was one of several planets in a vast universe, that entire continents across the ocean held civilizations previously unknown, and that human knowledge had few limits. It's no exaggeration to say the Renaissance and its immediate aftermath changed the map of the world and the map of the cosmos. It invited people to dream bigger, to wonder what else might be out there, and to go find out. Amidst all the creativity and exploration, the Renaissance also brought a critical eye to the one institution that had united Europe throughout the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church. The Church had long been the keeper of learning and the supreme spiritual authority. But as humanists encouraged people to question established ideas, and as literacy spread, more individuals read the Bible and classical Christian texts for themselves. They began to notice discrepancies between the Church's practices and the Scriptures. At the same time, the Church in the late medieval period faced criticism for corruption. Some popes lived more like worldly princes than pious shepherds, and the selling of indulgences, a kind of forgiveness for sins for a price, struck many as an abuse. These tensions were the tinder. The Renaissance intellectual climate provided the spark for the Protestant Reformation, a religious revolution that would shatter the unity of Western Christianity. Humanism played a role by encouraging people to question authority and interpret texts for themselves. Renaissance scholars like Erasmus, though he remained a Catholic, openly critiqued the Church's excesses and called for reform. The newfound ability to print the Bible in vernacular languages meant that lay people could read the Scriptures directly. For the first time in history, a farmer in Germany or a merchant's wife in England could potentially own a Bible in their own language and form their own understanding of its message, rather than relying solely on a priest's interpretation. This was empowering and dangerous to an institution used to being the sole interpreter of God's Word. In 1517, a German monk and theology professor named Martin Luther reached a breaking point. Outraged by the sale of indulgences in his region, money was being raised to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, but it was pitched to believers as paying for reduced time in purgatory for their souls. Luther wrote up 95 theses critiquing these and other church practices. Legend has it he nailed them to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Whether or not the nailing happened exactly that way, his theses were soon printed and spread across Germany, causing an uproar. Luther's core message was that salvation came by faith alone, and that the Bible was the only true authority, not church traditions or decrees. He questioned the Pope's authority to forgive sins for money and criticized the moral failings of the clergy. What started as an academic dispute turned into an open challenge to the papacy. By 1521, Luther was excommunicated and declared an outlaw by the Holy Roman Emperor. But many German princes protected him, partly out of conviction and partly as a way to assert independence from Rome. Thus began the Protestant Reformation. Once unleashed, the Reformation spread quickly, fracturing into different movements. In Switzerland, Huldrych Zwingli led reform in Zurich, and later John Calvin in Geneva developed a rigorous Protestant theology emphasizing predestination. In England, King Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534 for a mix of personal, political, and religious reasons, establishing the Church of England. Scandinavia adopted Lutheran ideas. What all these movements had in common was rejecting the supremacy of the Pope and many aspects of Catholic doctrine and ritual. They were protesting the old church, hence the term Protestant. Thanks to the printing press, reformers could disseminate pamphlets, sermons, and translations of the Bible at an unprecedented pace. Luther's German Bible, Calvin's writings, and many others circulated widely, winning converts and also prompting fierce debates. For ordinary people, this was a time of great religious excitement and turmoil. Imagine hearing that everything you had been taught, the necessity of priests, the Mass, the saints, the elaborate church hierarchy, might be wrong or at least not necessary for salvation. Some felt liberated and empowered by the idea that they could have a direct relationship with God without an intermediary. Others felt confused or angered that the old certainties were being questioned. Communities took sides. Families were sometimes split. This very personal and emotional element of the Reformation set it apart from the somewhat more elitist realms of art and science. Faith touches everyone. The Catholic Church, of course, did not take these challenges lying down. It launched the Counter-Reformation, a campaign to reform itself from within and to combat the spread of Protestantism. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, was a major church council that addressed abuses. It ended the sale of indulgences, for example, but also reaffirmed core Catholic doctrines that Protestants had attacked. The council also put forth new rules to discipline clergy and established seminaries to properly train priests. Importantly, the Church also used art as a tool in what's known as the Catholic Reformation. The Baroque art style that followed the Renaissance was more emotional and dramatic, aimed at inspiring renewed faith among believers. But there was also a harsher side. In 1542, the papacy revived the Roman Inquisition, a system of church courts, to root out heresy. And after Trent, the Index of Forbidden Books listed works deemed dangerous to faith. As we saw with Galileo's story, the Inquisition would go so far as to persecute even scientists whose ideas contradicted church teachings by the early 1600s. The Council of Trent explicitly made holding humanist or unorthodox religious views potentially heretical, effectively censoring many aspects of free thought. In 1545, the same year Trent began, the Church established the Society of Jesus, Jesuits, a new religious order founded by Ignatius of Loyola, which became a spearhead for re-energizing Catholic education and missionary work. The Jesuits, highly educated and disciplined, were like soldiers of faith combating Protestant influence and spreading Catholicism to new lands. They'd be active in Asia and the Americas as well. The conflict between Protestant reformers and Catholic authorities led to more than a century of religious wars and persecutions in Europe. This is a grim chapter that stands in contrast to the optimistic image of the Renaissance. In France, for example, Protestants, Huguenots, and Catholics engaged in a series of wars, including the notorious St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were killed. The Netherlands fought to break free from Catholic Spain. The Holy Roman Empire, largely Germany, was engulfed by the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, a brutal conflict with heavy religious overtones that killed a huge portion of the population. That war finally ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which allowed rulers to choose the religion of their own state and basically acknowledged a permanent split in Western Christianity. By the mid-17th century, Europe was no longer united under one church. A Protestant North and Catholic South had emerged, with many variations within, of course. This split was one of the most profound changes in European history, and it traces its roots to the Renaissance era's spirit of inquiry and calls for reform. Indeed, humanism encouraged Europeans to question the role of the Catholic Church during the Renaissance, opening the door for Luther and others to voice their criticisms. The printing press allowed, for the first time, those criticisms and new interpretations of Scripture to reach a mass audience. The result was an irreversible transformation of the religious landscape. It's worth noting that not all Renaissance figures embraced the fracturing of Christendom. Some, like Erasmus, advocated reform, but tried to avoid splitting the church. Others, like Sir Thomas More in England, remained staunchly Catholic and even died for it. More was executed for refusing to accept Henry VIII's supremacy over the Church of England. The Reformation also had the unintended consequence of damping some of the Renaissance freedom in certain areas. For instance, in Italy, as the Counter-Reformation took hold, the previously permissive attitude of popes like Leo X, a Medici pope who had sponsored artists and scholars liberally, gave way to more censorship and caution. After all, when the church feels under attack, it becomes less tolerant of any perceived dissent. Scholars in Italy after 1550 trod carefully. The days when a Copernicus could dedicate his heliocentric theory to the Pope as he did in 1543 to Pope Paul III, were gone. By 1616, the Church banned Copernican books. Even art was affected. Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco, 1541, had to have some nude figures painted over with drapery after the Council of Trent's decrees on appropriate religious art. In short, the Renaissance's light brought new heat as well. The period saw not only enlightenment, but also conflict born of that enlightenment. People's consciences were awakened, and they could not remain passive. Many felt compelled to fight for what they believed to be true faith, whether Protestant or Catholic. The long-term result was greater religious diversity and eventually, much later, the idea of religious toleration. But that would be an idea more of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. In the thick of the 16th and 17th centuries, it was often a fight to the death over whose vision of God and salvation would prevail. The Renaissance had shattered the old monopoly on truth, and the immediate aftermath was chaotic and bloody. Yet, from that fire, new freedom of thought did arise in the long run. People had broken the spell of unquestioned authority, and that genie would not go back into the bottle. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, historians see the Renaissance as gradually giving way to new currents. The Baroque in art and architecture, the scientific revolution in thought, and the age of absolutism in politics. No grand era lasts forever, and the Renaissance was no exception. Several factors combined to bring about the end of this extraordinary age of light. One major factor was political and military turmoil, especially in Italy. The Italian city-states that had been the cradle of the Renaissance faced repeated invasions and wars starting in the late 15th century. In 1494, a French army invaded Italy, seeking to claim the throne of Naples. This sparked the Italian Wars, a series of conflicts involving France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states that would last until 1559. These wars often turned Italy's cities into battlegrounds. In 1527, the unthinkable happened. Imperial troops, largely German mercenaries, some of them Protestants hostile to the Pope, sacked Rome brutally. This sack of Rome effectively ended the Roman Renaissance. It all but ended the papacy's role as a major patron of art and architecture for a time. Many artists fled, churches and palaces were looted, and the psychological blow was enormous. If the eternal city could be humbled so, the optimistic humanist dreams dimmed. Similarly, Florence's golden age ended when the Medici were expelled and Savonarola's bonfire burned. Although the Medici returned, Florence, too, was never quite the same vibrant republic, eventually becoming a duchy under Medici rule. By the late 1500s, Italy's economy also declined relative to the new Atlantic powers. Changing trade routes, with global commerce shifting to the ocean trade with the New World and Asia, meant Italian merchants lost their privileged position. The wealth that had funded so much art was not as abundant. Patronage of artists waned as money went into war or flowed to the rising states of Spain, Portugal, and later Holland and England. Another factor was the aforementioned counter-Reformation pressures. After the 1540s, the Catholic Church, in its effort to assert control, imposed censorship and a more rigid climate of thought in Catholic countries. The Inquisition in Italy made humanists and freethinkers wary. Ideas deemed too unorthodox could land one in prison or worse. For example, the Dominican friar Giordano Bruno, who dared to theorize that the universe was infinite and that stars were suns with their own planets, ideas that went beyond even Copernicus, was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600 as a heretic. The chilling effect of such actions can't be underestimated. Creativity in literature and philosophy in Italy suffered. Some intellectuals relocated to more tolerant environments, like how Galileo's students carried on science in the Netherlands or elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Protestant countries had their own orthodoxy to enforce. For instance, scientists like Michael Servetus, who challenged the Trinity, were executed in Calvin's Geneva. The intense religious atmosphere of the late 16th century was simply not as conducive to the easy humanist exchange of ideas that the early Renaissance had enjoyed. Many Renaissance thinkers feared being too bold, which stifled creativity in this climate. By the early 17th century, scholars often mark the Renaissance as having faded out. In Italy, the death of major figures tells a story. Michelangelo died in 1564. Shakespeare and Galileo both died in the 1610s to 1640s. By 1620, the center of cultural innovation had arguably shifted from Italy to places like Holland, England, and France, where different movements were taking hold. The Baroque style, for example, was flourishing, still drawing on Renaissance achievements, but with a new dramatic flair and often tied to the Counter-Reformation's aims. In politics, the ideals of small republics and citizen participation that thrived in Renaissance Florence or Venice gave way to larger kingdoms and emerging nation-states under strong rulers, absolute monarchs like Louis XIV of France later in the 17th century. The wars of religion also exhausted many regions. After 1648, Europe entered a period of trying to rebuild and find stability, setting the stage for the Enlightenment. Of course, pinning an end date on such a complex movement is somewhat arbitrary. Different historians suggest different markers. Some say the Renaissance ended around 1527 with the sack of Rome. Others extend it to 1600 or even the mid-17th century. But generally, by 1650, the cultural landscape was distinctly different from that of 1500. One might say the torch passed. The spirit of inquiry lived on, but in new forms. The Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s, for instance, owed a huge debt to the Renaissance's breakthroughs, but focused more on reason and science explicitly. The modern nation-state system that emerged after the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, also set a new stage for intellectual and cultural life. Scholars also debate the Renaissance's impact and uniqueness. Some modern historians argue that the Renaissance wasn't a complete break from the Middle Ages, noting that many medieval elements persisted and that the two eras overlapped more than the grand narrative suggests. They point out that the Middle Ages had its own vibrant intellectual and artistic moments, think of Gothic architecture or scholastic philosophy, that are sometimes unfairly downplayed. Indeed, the term Dark Ages is seen as an exaggeration by many experts. Nevertheless, even if we acknowledge continuity, there is broad agreement that the Renaissance did usher in significant changes in how Europeans thought about themselves and the world. By the time the Renaissance faded, Europeans were no longer looking solely backward to classical times or upward to heavenly salvation. They were looking forward and outward to new worlds, new knowledge, and a belief in progress. In that sense, the Renaissance's end was really a transition, as its light merged into the dawn of the truly modern age. If the Renaissance as a time period eventually came to a close, the legacy of the Renaissance lived on and continues to influence us today. This era changed the course of history in countless ways. It's often said that the Renaissance bridged the gap between the medieval world and modern civilization, and that is evident in multiple realms. In art, the techniques and standards set by Renaissance masters became the foundation of Western art going forward. The emphasis on realism, perspective, and human anatomy would dominate until the late 19th century, when artists started to deliberately break from realism. Every time you see a realistic portrait or a three-dimensional video game graphic, you're seeing the influence of the Renaissance insistence on observing reality and imitating it. The very concept of the artist as a creative genius, Leonardo, Michelangelo, etc., started in the Renaissance. Before, artists were seen more as craftsmen. After the Renaissance, artists held a new prestige in society, paving the way for art's continued evolution. In science and education, the Renaissance's promotion of inquiry set the stage for modern science. Copernicus, Galileo, and others not only made specific discoveries, but also established the idea that we could understand the world through observation, experimentation, and mathematics, rather than relying solely on ancient authorities. This empirical approach is the bedrock of the scientific method. The humanist educational curriculum, with its liberal arts focus, is still the model in many universities today, a broad education that fosters critical thinking across disciplines. The Renaissance ideal of the well-rounded individual, someone who is not just a specialist but has knowledge of arts, sciences, and sports, the uomo universal or Renaissance man, remains a respected ideal. We see it in modern schooling where students study a bit of history, literature, science, art, and more before specializing in literature and language. The choice of Renaissance writers to use and elevate vernacular languages gave us the great national literatures. Imagine if Dante hadn't written the Divine Comedy in Italian, or if Shakespeare hadn't written plays in English accessible in his time to the common person. By choosing local tongues, they legitimize those languages for high expression. As a result, Italian, English, Spanish, French, and others blossomed into rich literary languages, unifying people through a shared tongue and stories. Modern Italian speakers can still read some of Dante. English speakers revel in Shakespeare's coinage of new words and expressions. The Renaissance broadened the audience of literature beyond the clergy and scholars, which in a way is a step toward the mass media of today. In religion, the immediate legacy of the Renaissance and Reformation was a divided Western Christianity, Catholic and various Protestant churches, and a series of religious conflicts. But in the long run, this pluralism contributed to the idea of freedom of conscience. When it became clear that no one faction could easily wipe out the others, as the wars of religion ended in stalemate, Europeans gradually and painfully learned to coexist with religious differences. This laid groundwork for the later Enlightenment idea that the state should not impose a single religion, a key principle in many modern secular democracies. Also, the Catholic Church itself was reformed. Rampant corruption, like the open sale of indulgences, was curtailed. Seminaries improved clergy education, and new vibrant orders like the Jesuits reinvigorated Catholicism, leading to great missionary efforts in Asia and the Americas. So both sides of the religious divide underwent revitalization. The availability of printed Bibles and emphasis on personal faith in Protestant areas also encouraged literacy and individual responsibility, influencing the culture of places like England, Germany, and America in enduring ways. In exploration and globalization, the Renaissance voyages permanently connected the continents. The Columbian exchange of plants, animals, and ideas reshaped diets and populations. Potatoes from Peru to Ireland, horses from Europe to the Americas, etc. The era also saw the beginnings of a truly global economy and the painful birth of a globalized world, including the transatlantic slave trade initiated by European colonial powers. The mindset that humans could venture into the unknown gave impetus, centuries later, to exploration beyond Earth. One could draw a line from Magellan's circumnavigation to NASA's voyages to the Moon. Both were driven by that restless Renaissance curiosity to push boundaries. In philosophy and worldview, the Renaissance put the human being at the center, not to displace God, for many Renaissance people were devout, but to enrich the understanding of God's greatest creation, humanity. This human-centered perspective evolved into what we call humanism, and later, secular humanism. It underlies modern concepts of human rights and dignity. Renaissance thinkers like Pico, who celebrated human freedom and potential, are intellectual ancestors of later declarations that humans are born with inalienable rights. The idea that individuals can shape their destiny, as opposed to the medieval notion of fixed social roles and divine predestination of all events, has encouraged social mobility, personal development, and the spirit of innovation that characterizes modern society. Culturally, the Renaissance inspired a reverence for the classical past that is still evident. Our government buildings echo Greek and Roman architecture, thanks in part to Renaissance revival of classical styles. Concepts of democracy and republic were re-examined by Renaissance scholars reading Livy, Cicero, and Plato, influencing political thought in later centuries. The American and French revolutionaries, for instance, were deeply inspired by classical models which they accessed through Renaissance translations and commentaries. Even the notion of balancing faith with reason, or science with spirit, has its roots in the Renaissance attempts to harmonize Christian theology and ancient philosophy. It's also worth noting that the Renaissance is a story of human resilience and creativity that can inspire us on a personal level. It teaches that even after a period of crisis or darkness, renewal is possible. Petrarch climbing a mountain, Leonardo sketching a flying machine, or Galileo gazing at the moons of Jupiter. These are images of individuals daring to see things differently and striving for something higher. The emotional arc from darkness to light resonates through time. Many later historical renaissances, the term can be used broadly for any cultural flowering, drew direct inspiration from the 15th century Italian example. For instance, the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, America, a flourishing of African American art and literature, explicitly used the term to signify rebirth. Whenever societies invest in the arts, education, and the free exchange of ideas, we often compare it to the Renaissance. In summary, the Renaissance changed everything in the sense that it changed how humans think about change itself. In the medieval worldview, the past was golden and the future was apocalypse. Things were static or declining. In the Renaissance view, the past was a guide and a treasure, yes, but the future could be shaped by human effort. People began to imagine progress, that each generation might add to knowledge and improve life. This set the stage for the modern era's constant innovation. We've traveled a long road from the depths of the so-called Dark Ages to the glories of the Renaissance and beyond. It's astonishing to consider how much transformed in those centuries. Europe went from a fragmented, fearful place to a bustling hub of creativity and exploration. The Renaissance truly changed everything. Art blossomed into realism and genius. Science broke free of ancient bonds. Religion was reshaped and challenged, and the map of the world itself was redrawn. It was a time when humanity dared to emerge from the shadows and step into the light of new ideas. The story of the Renaissance is not just the story of famous names like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Galileo, or Luther. It's the story of people, countless ordinary people, whose lives were touched by new opportunities to learn, to see beautiful images, to read new books, to question old customs. It's the story of human potential realized, how, given freedom and inspiration, individuals can create wonders that echo through the ages. It's also a story of caution. Changes can bring conflict, and not all outcomes were positive for everyone. But even through turmoil, the ideas born in the Renaissance proved more durable than any one painting or one prince's reign. Those ideas, the dignity of man, the power of education, the value of inquiry, the beauty of the natural world, continue to guide us. Today, we enjoy a world deeply shaped by the Renaissance. When we walk into a museum and admire a painting, or when we use the scientific method to solve a problem, or when we champion individual rights and education, we are heirs of the Renaissance. The light that was kindled in Florence, Rome, and beyond now belongs to all of humanity. It reminds us that even after a period of darkness, renewal is possible. Knowledge lost can be found again. New knowledge can be discovered. Bridges can be built between past and future, between different cultures, as the Renaissance itself was a bridge incorporating ideas from the ancient Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Arabs. As we conclude this journey from darkness to light, let's carry forward the Renaissance spirit, a spirit of curiosity, creativity, and courage. We too live in challenging times, but the Renaissance teaches that through bold imagination and willingness to question, we can illuminate our world in new ways. Thank you for joining this exploration of one of history's most exciting eras. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Renaissance and learned something new, please give this video a thumbs up. We'd love to have you as part of our community of history enthusiasts. So hit that subscribe button for more journeys through time, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming videos. What part of the Renaissance inspires you the most? Or which figure would you want to meet if you could? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. Until next time, keep seeking the light of knowledge, and thanks for watching.